Hello there, Happy New Year, and welcome to our first Talking Europe debate of 2022. Now, we're having to record this programme with our guests at a distance due to what the French Health Minister has described as a tidal wave of COVID cases since the emergence of the Omicron variant of COVID-19. Well, this is particularly relevant to our programme as today we're discussing how to get out of the pandemic and whether making vaccines against COVID-19 compulsory is the way forward. This week, France's President Macron said he wanted to, I'm self-censoring here slightly, pee off the unvaccinated and convince them to get their jabs by limiting their access to certain social spaces like restaurants and cinemas. Austria, meanwhile, is set to become the first EU state to make the jabs mandatory as of February 1st. Others are considering it, and the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, wants an EU-wide discussion. Now, with me to discuss this issue, we have Austrian MEP Hannes Haider, who's from the European Parliament's Socialists and Democrats group, and Luxembourgish MEP Charles Goerens from the centrist Renew Europe group. Hello to both of you.
Hello.
Well, let's start off by going through a couple of statistics and facts for you and for our viewers. First of all, here in France, about 90% of eligible people aged 12 and over are fully vaccinated, according to the French Health Ministry. Now, despite the fact that only around 10% of eligible people are unvaccinated, the unvaccinated account for more than half of intensive care admissions here in France. And just to talk about the mandatory vaccination situation, as I said, Austria making it mandatory from February the 1st, Germany and Poland considering mandatory vaccines. Currently, we have mandatory vaccines for health workers in France, Germany, Italy, Greece and Hungary. And countries that have no plans for mandatory vaccines at all, Denmark and Sweden, just to give you a little overview there. Well, let's come to my guests. Hannes Haider, you are in Austria, the first EU state to make vaccines against COVID-19 mandatory. Where do you stand on this?
So I'm convinced that it should not have been necessary because if we had a higher vaccination rate, then it would not have been necessary. We have at the moment about 42% that are boosted with 3 doses, and first dose we have 74.3%, so 26% are not vaccinated. The pandemic was more or less declared stopped during summer, and there were not enough vaccination points. So I feel that there were failures by the government. But there was also a very dramatic situation in November, in mid-November, and this changed the game. There was another lockdown, but this situation was necessary or was the reason for the mandatory vaccination that should start with 1st February, as you said. We had full intensive care units. The medical treatment and operations had to be postponed. Especially cancer patients were the people that had no chance to get their operations, and there was pressure by public and media. So it seems the only way to get out of this situation is mandatory vaccinations.
Well, if there is no other approach to overcome the pandemic, we must be open for new developments. We will have a debate in this regard in 2 weeks in the national parliament, and then we can see the arguments laid down by those who are in favor of mandatory vaccination and those who are opposed to it. But we must keep in mind that we have a collective duty to overcome this crisis, this pandemic.
So you believe it's somewhat of a last resort. Do you think that given the Omicron variant, which spreads so quickly, as we've seen in France and in the UK, Mr. Goerens, do you see that there are still other options available right now to Luxembourg?
What we do need is a better information. In certain sense, we need more targeted personal talks with those who are more reluctant to the vaccination. But for me personally, vaccination is a moral duty. I have to tell people it would be best to inoculate population like we once did to protect against polio. That's my point of view. But I see that there are very reluctant people based on on informations that are not in line with the last scientific acknowledgements. And for me, it's a very serious situation. I am very concerned about the discussion, how it's evolving for the time being.
Hannes Haider, coming back to you, a lot of people arguing that it is a breach of their civil liberties and individual freedoms for Austria to make vaccines compulsory in this way. Is it not the case that the medicines that a person chooses to put inside their body, it should be their choice?
So you mentioned the vaccination rates as an argument for mandatory vaccination, but it's not only the rate of vaccinated. It's also a theme, or it has also is also a question of the health system. And if you have full intensive care units and units you need for people that are endangered, then I'm convinced that individual freedom stops here. And individual freedom ends where it becomes an elementary danger for society. And democracy, for me, is about dealing with the weakest in society. And we are in the situation that people are endangered. Yes, you can say, I didn't get it, I didn't have it, I wasn't infected, so I don't want to get vaccinated. But it's a danger for other citizens in our society. And it's a democratic right to take care of these people. And if you remember, the smallpox vaccination was mandatory in Austria till 1981. So this is not something out of time and something we don't know. And my colleague has mentioned polio. Even today, it did not work to get rid of polio in the world. And there were big efforts, and people don't have a problem with the vaccination here in Austria.
Mr. Goerens, picking up on what Mr. Haider said there about individual freedom stops where it endangers other people. Would you agree with that?
Well, let's say in principle, international human rights law recognizes the right to health. It recognizes an implicit duty to take steps necessary for the prevention, treatment, and control of the pandemic. Protections for human rights are not absolute. They can interfere with a right that may be justified based on the risk of harm to others. In my view, mandatory vaccination requirements that are imposed as a condition for the right to work, for instance, are to be presumed to be unavoidable for the subject of such requirements. That's my principal view. Once again, I am very open to the discussion concerning mandatory vaccinations, but we have to act in a way that all the other ways had been taken into account before that.
Okay, I'd like to move on to a point of view that we keep hearing from the World Health Organization. We keep hearing these reminders that the pandemic does not exist just here in Europe. By definition, it is global. Are European governments being short-sighted by focusing on getting everyone vaccinated here in Europe when only 15% of Africans are currently vaccinated? Mr. Haider, I put that to you.
So the problem of European governments and our countries is that we have enough vaccines and people don't take it. I'm, of course, supporting COVAX, global access to the vaccination, and it's the basis for a fight against pandemics and mutations. So we cannot figure it out, or we cannot stand against this pandemic only in Europe. And you see, Omicron is said to come from South Africa, and it's also other mutations that come from other continents. So it's a duty, not only a moral duty, it's a practical duty to make global access. And I think it's very strange that Austria, for example, had to destroy vaccines, and countries like Nigeria got expired vaccines. This is a very strange situation. And it's another argument for going to get vaccinated and for a mandatory vaccination. And global access is necessary to fight this pandemic and all the mutations.
Mr. Goerens, where do you stand on vaccinating other parts of the world? Mr. Haider talked about COVAX, the vaccine donations. Other people talk about allowing intellectual property rights to be waived, patents to be waived. Would you support that, to allow production in other parts of the world?
Well, what we need is what I would like to express in French, an obligation de résultat, an obligation to be successful at the end of the day. What we must take into consideration is the fact that we have to deal with a global pandemic, and the response to this global pandemic must be global. And concerning vaccination, we have to act in a way that we are able to vaccinate everybody around the globe. And you said in your introductory remarks that we are very short-sighted by vaccinating only people in industrialized countries. That's true, but let me say, in addition to that, that the European Union is less short-sighted than others, because we have be at the very beginning of the process called COVAX, and we are continuing to export vaccines to developing countries. That's the way to proceed. But nevertheless, we see that there is a gap between the industrialized countries and developing countries, and we can overcome it by fulfilling a request laid down in a declaration in 2003 or 4 at the so-called Doha process. When it comes to producing vaccines, you must operate a transfer of technologies from the industrialized countries to developing countries. This is a promise laid down in the 2003 declaration. I think it was 2003. Let's fulfill this promise. Let's keep this promise.
All right, thank you both very much for taking part in our debate, Hannes Haider and Charles Goerens.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to you for watching. Hope to see you in part 2 of the programme in a couple of minutes' time.